They marched through the dust, boots dragging, eyes empty. Thousands of German prisoners, exhausted, beaten, and expecting humiliation, shuffled toward the hastily erected barbed wire fences of an American camp in Texas. The heat was oppressive. Sweat dripped down faces that hadn't been washed in days. Their commanders had warned them that capture by Americans meant degradation and worse. They imagined fists, jeers, and orders barked in broken, mangled words. After years of propaganda, they believed the enemy to be barbaric, uncultured, barely civilized. They steeled themselves for humiliation. Then it happened. A voice cut through the silence, sharp, commanding, and unmistakably familiar. Guten Morgen, willkommen. The German soldiers froze mid-step. This was not broken, stammered English spoken by some American farm boy. It was fluent German, precise, perfectly enunciated, and tinged with a regional accent from Saxony that felt almost like home. The voice belonged to a US Army guard who stood with rifle slung casually over his shoulder, watching the columns with patient interest. For many prisoners, it was the most surreal moment of their lives. They were captives in a foreign land, thousands of miles from home on a Texas plain, yet the language of their childhood suddenly echoed from the mouths of their captors. The language they had learned at their mother's knees, the language they had studied in German schools, the language of their very identity. Shock rippled through the columns like a physical force. Men stopped whispering. Some froze completely. Others exchanged glances of profound disbelief. Men whispered urgently to each other, passing theories through the ranks. Some suspected a trick, an elaborate psychological game designed to confuse them. Others thought they were hallucinating after days of hunger and fatigue and dehydration. A few wondered if they had died and were now experiencing some bizarre purgatory. How could Americans, whom Nazi propaganda had painted as culturally ignorant and barbaric, speak the German language so fluently? How could they possess such perfect diction, such authentic pronunciation, such understanding of regional nuance? The truth was more scandalous than any of them imagined, and at that moment, very few prisoners could even begin to grasp what it meant. They had encountered something their minds could not fully process. The enemy spoke their language, and that changed everything. Long before this encounter, long before the war even engulfed America, the United States had quietly begun preparing for this exact moment. Do you know that by 1943, the US Army had trained entire battalions of German-speaking interrogators and guards? Write in the comments if this fact surprises you, because most people never realize just how sophisticated this preparation was. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't improvisation. This was deliberate strategy, planned years in advance by military intelligence officials who understood something crucial about psychology and warfare. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? What time is it where you are right now? Because this story isn't just about language and preparation. It's about shock, betrayal, and the moment when an enemy's entire understanding of the world collapsed. It's about what happens when you discover that your enemy speaks your language better than you do. It's about the unsettling realization that victory and defeat aren't just measured in military terms, but in psychological ones. And it's about the strange, tragic lives of men caught between two homelands. The story begins in the refugee communities of America. Between the two world wars, millions of German-speaking immigrants lived throughout the United States. In Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, and New York, German was spoken in homes, churches, and streets. German-language newspapers thrived. German theaters showed plays performed in the original tongue. German restaurants served authentic food. Many of these immigrants had fled Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany after the First World War, seeking fresh starts and economic opportunity. Others were Jews escaping Hitler's tightening grip in the 1930s, watching the noose close around their necks with every passing month. Some were simply economic migrants seeking opportunity and the dream of America. Whatever their reason for coming to America, they had brought their language with them, and Washington understood this was a resource beyond measure. When Roosevelt's administration began preparing for inevitable war in the late 1930s, military intelligence quietly turned to these communities. They understood something crucial that many Americans didn't. Language was a weapon. If America faced German soldiers, American officers needed to understand not just what they said, but how they thought. The Military Intelligence Service, or MIS, launched one of the most unusual programs of the entire conflict. They began recruiting German-speaking Americans, many of them refugees with every reason to fight the Reich. These weren't just ordinary soldiers picked at random. They were linguists, scholars, professors, teachers, and ordinary workers who could speak with native fluency. Some were brilliant academics from Berlin who had escaped with nothing but their minds. Others were teenagers who had fled Vienna just months before, their families still trapped under Nazi rule. Almost all of them carried deep grudges against Hitler's regime, personal reasons that went beyond patriotism. Some had lost families, others had lost homes, property, and careers. A few had been politically persecuted. What's remarkable is how the army found them. Recruiters literally searched telephone directories of major cities looking for German-sounding surnames. If you were a Schmidt, a Bergman, or a Möller in 1942, there's an entirely plausible chance you received a letter from the War Department inviting you to serve in an unusual capacity. The selection was deliberate. The training was intense. At Fort Ritchie in Maryland, later expanded to a secret facility in Minnesota, these men spent 12 hours a day in drills. German grammar, military terminology, dialects from different regions. They memorized the accent patterns of Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, and the Rhineland. They learned that an officer from Berlin spoke differently from an officer from Vienna. They studied humor, understood references to German literature, could quote German poets if needed. They mastered not just the language, but the culture underneath it. They learned how to thin, K-like Germans even while serving as Americans. They became, in essence, Germans wearing American uniforms. Some insiders jokingly referred to this growing force as Roosevelt's German Legion. By 1943, entire battalions had been trained and deployed across the European theatre. But many were stationed at camps inside America itself, waiting for the day when German prisoners would arrive on American soil. That day came sooner than anyone expected. Here's where history becomes scandalous. Many of these German-speaking men and women were technically still German citizens when the war began. Some had barely escaped on the last ships before the Atlantic closed to refugees after 1939. Their loyalty to America was absolute, their devotion to fighting Hitler unquestionable. Yet their citizenship paperwork sometimes suggested otherwise. Think about that contradiction. They couldn't fully become American citizens because of legal restrictions, yet they served America with everything they had. For the Nazi regime, this was the ultimate betrayal. Germans using their own mother tongue to serve a foreign enemy. This wasn't just pragmatic, it was ideological warfare. The revelation cut at the very heart of Nazi ideology. It exposed the lie that Germany was a unified racial state, a monolithic block of people bound together by blood and destiny. It proved that not all Germans stood beneath the swastika. It showed that Germans could reject Germany. It demonstrated that loyalty was more complicated than blood and soil. When captured, German soldiers first encountered these guards. The psychological shock was devastating on multiple levels. It wasn't just shock at hearing their language spoken so fluently. It was shock at understanding that their enemy had infiltrated their very identity, understood their culture, spoke their dialects. It was the realization that America was far more prepared, far more sophisticated, far more dangerous than Nazi propaganda had ever suggested. Did you know that the US Army had interrogation centers at Fort Hunt, Virginia, codenamed P.O. Box 1142, where almost all the interrogators spoke fluent German? Drop a yes or no in the comments if that detail surprises you, because this wasn't just a random camp. This was the heart of American intelligence operations, where high-value prisoners were sent to give up their secrets, and every interrogator there could think like a German, and speak like a German, and manipulate like someone who truly understood the German mind. The moment of capture varied for different men. Some German soldiers surrendered in North Africa in 1943 after defeat at El Alamein. Others were captured during the slow crawl through Italy. Still others didn't give up until the final days in Europe, fighting in the rubble of cities, refusing surrender until ammunition ran out. But whether they surrendered in the desert or in the rubble of cities, whether they came willingly or were taken by force, the experience was hauntingly similar. A soldier drops his rifle into the sand. He raises his hand slowly, waiting for the expected blow. He braces himself for violence, for degradation, for everything Nazi propaganda had promised about American brutality. He has heard the stories. Germans who surrendered to Americans were beaten. They were starved. They were humiliated in front of their comrades. He steels himself, closing his mind off, preparing for the worst. Then, instead of blows, he hears a voice. That familiar voice speaking German. Not broken German. Not German with an American accent struggling to pronounce the consonants correctly. Fluent German, speaking to him as if the speaker had grown up 3 blocks from his childhood home. One captured lieutenant later wrote in a secret diary that when an American guard corrected his grammar in flawless Bavarian dialect, he felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. The world had inverted. Nothing made sense anymore. A major from Hamburg confessed years after the war that he thought the Americans had somehow smuggled a German officer into disguise, a spy or a defector dressed up as an American soldier. Officers who prided themselves on their education and their cultured upbringing were humiliated when their American captors pointed out dialectical errors or mispronunciations with the casual authority of someone who had spoken German since childhood, who understood the grammar rules better than they did themselves. One prisoner remembered a guard casually quoting from a Schiller poem he had learned in school in the 1920s, reciting the verses perfectly with the proper rhythm and emphasis, then laughing when the German officer's face went pale. It wasn't just about the language, it was about the realization that the enemy knew more about German culture than some Germans did. It was about discovering that someone wearing an American uniform understood Goethe and Heine and the subtleties of German romantic poetry. How was that possible? For men who had been taught that Germans were the masters of culture and civilization, this was psychologically devastating in ways that military defeat could never quite achieve. It was about understanding that the Americans had studied them, prepared for them, anticipated them. For men raised to believe in racial and cultural superiority, this was psychologically devastating. This raises an open question that historians still debate today. Did this fluent German spoken by American guards make prisoners more cooperative or more paranoid? Some argue that hearing their native language created trust, made men more willing to open up, more willing to talk, because the barrier of language had been removed. Others insist it deepened suspicion, convincing prisoners that America had infiltrated German villages and planted spies everywhere, that somehow the Americans had cousins or relatives back in the old country. Perhaps both were true. Different men reacted differently. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Would you have felt safer hearing your native language from the enemy, or would it have terrified you? Would you have opened up or closed down? Inside the camps, the shock only deepened day after day. Barbed wire surrounded sprawling compounds, stretching across hundreds of acres. Guard towers rose against the sky at intervals, their observation platforms offering unobstructed views of the entire yard. Searchlights swept across the grounds at night, creating an illusion of security and control. And then there were the guards, calling out orders in crisp, fluent German that echoed across the compounds. Antreten zur Essensausgabe. fall in for meal distribution. Ruhe, Stille, quiet, silence. For the German prisoners, it was disorienting, almost dreamlike. They were in America, thousands of miles from home, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Yet the very language of home surrounded them constantly. The language they heard in the morning, the language they heard with their meals, the language they heard when guards passed in the evening. One prisoner later wrote in secret notes that he sometimes forgot he was a captive. When a guard spoke in the local dialect of his hometown, for just a moment, he could pretend he was back home. He could close his eyes and pretend he was hearing his brother speak, or his uncle, or someone from his village. This created a strange psychological state, unlike anything described in military manuals or in training. The camps became surreal places where normalcy and captivity blurred into something unrecognizable. In some camps, guards deliberately used regional dialects to unsettle prisoners, to confuse them, to destabilize their sense of reality. A soldier from Bavaria might suddenly hear a U.S. guard address him in rustic Bavarian slang, complete with the grammatical peculiarities and word choices of rural Bavaria. A Prussian officer would be confronted with the clipped, formal German of Berlin society, the kind spoken in officers' clubs before the war. For the prisoners, it was deeply disorienting, almost maddening. Some swore the Americans must have embedded spies in their villages back home, people who reported to American intelligence officers. Others whispered that relatives back home had become traitors, collaborating with the enemy against their own countrymen. The debates in the barracks grew heated and bitter and paranoid. One group would argue that the Americans were just mimicking words they had learned in school from textbooks and language books. Others countered fiercely that no American could possibly sound so authentic without having lived in Germany, without having grown up there, without having absorbed the culture and the mentality through years of immersion. Some prisoners even whispered that these guards might be Germans themselves. Captured German officers somehow turned to the American cause. The truth, of course, was that many of these guards had lived in Germany. They had grown up there before immigrating in the 1920s and 1930s. They had attended German schools, celebrated German holidays, absorbed German culture so deeply that it remained part of their very identity, even wearing American uniforms and fighting against their former homeland. In some camps, German prisoners formed secret groups, trying to maintain Nazi discipline behind the wire. They organized, they spoke in whispers, they created hierarchies mirroring the Wehrmacht itself. When they discovered that some guards were German-speaking, that the Americans could understand their codes and their plans, could listen to every whispered conversation, they reacted with fury. The word Verräter, traitor, was whispered constantly in barracks late at night. Some prisoners spat when these guards passed. Others refused to respond when addressed in German, insisting on communicating only through interpreters or refusing to communicate at all. They wanted to deny the guards even the dignity of their mother tongue. But not all prisoners reacted with hostility. Some began quietly respecting these guards, admiring their fluency, even learning to appreciate their skill and courage. A few even admitted, years later, in interviews conducted after the war, that they understood why these men had chosen to leave Germany and fight for America. They escaped, they survived, they made a life for themselves in a new country. Perhaps they were wiser than we were, some would confess. Perhaps they saw what was coming. One prisoner later wrote that he had been standing in the camp yard when a guard overheard him speaking softly in dialect to another prisoner. The guard didn't respond immediately, but later that day, he deliberately positioned himself near the prisoner and began humming an old German folk song, one that was sung in the prisoner's home region, one that carried memories of childhood and peace. The prisoner wept that night, confused about whether to hate the guard or thank him. The line between enemy and human had become impossibly blurred. Who were these remarkable men and women standing guard over German prisoners? Some were professors who had fled the Nazis and left behind prestigious careers and university positions. Some were refugees who had lost everything to the regime, everything except their language and their memories. Many were Jews who had narrowly escaped extermination. One was a former boxer from Hamburg who had fled when Jewish athletes were expelled from German sports clubs and told they could never compete again in their own country. Another was a teacher from Berlin whose entire family had perished in the camps, murdered by the very regime he now stood against daily. A third was a teenage immigrant whose parents had smuggled him out on a children's transport, paying smugglers and bribing officials, losing TE, ouch with him forever as a result. Some were musicians, artists, businessmen, and factory workers. They represented the full spectrum of German immigrant life in America. These weren't abstract soldiers in uniforms. They were men and women with specific stories, with specific griefs, with specific reasons for hating the regime they now guarded against. They carried memories of a different Germany, one that was cultured and educated and sophisticated. They carried loss and grief beyond measure. Imagine the psychological weight they carried every single day. Each interrogation wasn't just duty or routine, it was personal. When a German officer sat across the table and recited Nazi talking points, the American guard didn't just hear words, he heard the very ideology that had destroyed his family. When a prisoner boasted about Nazi military victories and the glory of the Reich, the guard heard the voices of men who had murdered his relatives. When a prisoner spoke about German racial superiority and the destiny of the Aryan people, the guard thought of cousins and siblings he would never see again. Yet despite all this, they remained professional. They did their jobs with discipline and skill and dedication. They spoke German flawlessly, understood every word, every implication, every subtle attempt at manipulation. They extracted information that saved American lives. This is where historians still wrestle with the ethics decades later. Were these German-speaking Americans heroes or traitors? Some celebrate them as patriots who used their skills to fight evil and shorten the war, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of lives. Others, particularly some German veterans decades later, insisted in their memoirs that these men had betrayed their blood, their heritage, their very identity. They insisted these guards were worse than ordinary enemies because they had abandoned Germany itself. The question is complex and resists simple answers. If you were a German-born American in the 1940s, would you have taken up arms and language against your former homeland, fighting people who shared your culture, your language, your childhood? Or would you have stayed silent and anonymous? Write your TS below. This remains one of the most profound questions of the entire war, one that still divides historians, and that touches on fundamental questions about loyalty, identity, conscience, and what it truly means to be an American. The story of German-speaking guards in American camps represents something rarely discussed but profoundly important. It shows that the Second World War wasn't just fought with tanks and planes. It was fought with language, culture, psychology, and identity itself. The shock that German prisoners experienced when they heard their own language from American guards was a shock that rippled through their understanding of the world. It challenged everything they had been taught. It proved that America was more sophisticated, more prepared, more culturally aware than Nazi propaganda had suggested. And for many of those prisoners, it was the first crack in the foundation of their belief in Nazi superiority. So what do you think? Did these guards represent the best of America or something more troubling? Was language a weapon for good or a manipulation? Comment below, because this is a question that historians genuinely debate even now. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more forgotten stories of World War II. But here is the deeper question that has haunted historians and veterans alike for decades. When a man is spoken to in his mother tongue by the enemy, does it make him more likely to cooperate, or less? Does it build trust or suspicion? Some scholars argue that language stripped away the wall between captor and captive. When you can understand perfectly, when there are no translation barriers, when words flow naturally between two men, there emerges something dangerous to authority. The prisoner begins to see the guard not as a faceless enemy, but as a human being. He begins to empathize. He begins to question his own loyalty. An American interrogator sitting across from a German officer, speaking flawless German, asking questions with genuine curiosity, offering cigarettes and coffee. Sudder. Nally seems less like an enemy and more like a fellow human being who happens to wear a different uniform. Under these conditions, men talk. They confess. They give up secrets they swore they would take to their graves. They share stories from their childhood. They recall conversations with friends who died. They describe strategies their commanders had planned. The very act of speaking their native language with someone who understands perfectly seems to lower the defenses built up over years of military training. The psychological wall that separates soldiers from intimate disclosure simply crumbles when the conversation becomes comfortable. But here's the counter-argument that other historians make with equal conviction. Perhaps the German language wasn't creating trust at all. Perhaps it was the most sophisticated form of psychological manipulation. The prisoners thought they were dealing with Americans, foreign barbarians who couldn't possibly understand them. Instead, they discovered that the enemy was inside them, in their language, in their thoughts, in their very identity. This knowledge was more terrifying than any weapon. If the Americans had gone to such lengths to learn their language, if they had recruited German speakers, if they had trained interrogators in dialect and grammar and cultural nuance, then what else had the Americans prepared? What other surprises lay waiting? The language wasn't comforting. It was a threat. It suggested that the enemy was far more prepared, far more sophisticated, far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Which interpretation is correct? Perhaps both. Different prisoners experienced it differently. A man from a working-class background who had never received much education might have felt comforted by the familiar language, grateful to be understood. A German officer educated in Berlin, proud of his refinement and education, might have felt pure terror at discovering that his enemy understood him completely, that there was no privacy, no escape into incomprehension. For officers especially, the shock was devastating. They had been trained to be composed, to resist interrogation, to maintain discipline even under duress. But facing someone who not only understood their words but anticipated their thoughts, who could reference military protocols they had studied, who understood the cultural and social hierarchy of their own society, this was something they could not prepare for. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you were a captured soldier and discovered your captor spoke your language better than you did, would that make you trust him more or fear him more? Would you open up and talk, or would you close yourself off completely? Would it make you feel that the war was already lost? This is one of the most fascinating psychological questions to emerge from the war, and historians genuinely cannot agree on the answer. The truth is that language became a weapon in ways that generals and military strategists could not have predicted. At Fort Hunt, the secret interrogation facility in Virginia, codenamed P.O. Box 1142, intelligence officers discovered something remarkable. When German prisoners were interrogated through interpreters who didn't speak German natively, the prisoners resisted. They claimed not to understand. They misunderstood deliberately. They fought back against translation. They would pretend confusion. They would claim the translator had gotten the meaning wrong. They would insist they didn't know what was being asked. But when a fluent German speaker sat down across the table, the resistance collapsed almost instantly. The officer suddenly realized that every word he said was being understood perfectly. He couldn't hide behind misunderstandings. He couldn't claim he was misquoted. He couldn't play games with translation. He couldn't use language itself as a barrier or an excuse. This realization was psychologically devastating. It stripped away one of the last defenses available to a prisoner, the possibility that communication itself was impossible. One interrogator, himself a Jewish refugee from Frankfurt who had lost his entire family to the Nazi regime, would sit down across from German officers and simply listen. He wouldn't ask aggressive questions. He wouldn't use threats. He wouldn't lean forward menacingly or create an atmosphere of intimidation. He would simply let the officer talk, responding occasionally in perfect German, showing deep knowledge of German military operations, German strategy, German culture. Under the weight of that understanding, prisoners would reveal things they had no intention of revealing. They would confess not because they were tortured or threatened, but because they were exhausted by the realization that the enemy understood them completely. They were exhausted by the futility of resistance. One German captain later admitted in his memoirs that he gave up classified information about tank specifications and artillery positions simply because he couldn't bear the humiliation of being interrogated by an American who understood German military terminology better than he did himself. The interrogator would gently correct him when he misspoke, would reference German operational doctrines with precision, would sometimes even quote German military textbooks. The psychological effect was crushing. It was like being stripped naked in front of someone who knew every intimate detail of your life. What rifles and bayonets could never achieve, the sound of one's own language spoken perfectly by the enemy could accomplish. It was psychological warfare at its most subtle and its most devastating. Some historians call it brilliant strategy. Others call it a troubling precedent for psychological manipulation. What do you think? If interrogation through understanding and empathy is more effective than torture, does that make it ethical? Is there such a thing as kindness used as a weapon? Drop your answer below. The question of manipulation versus humanity haunts these interrogations, even now. Some historians praise the Americans for extracting information without torture, without violence, simply through the power of conversation and understanding. They point out that German prisoners in American camps were treated far better than prisoners held by the Soviets, far better than the horrific conditions endured by Allied prisoners in Japanese camps. They argue that using language as a tool of intelligence gathering was humane compared to the alternatives. Other historians are less certain. They point out that psychological manipulation can be as damaging as physical torture. When you break a man's sense of identity, when you shatter his belief in his own culture and superiority, when you prove to him that the enemy understands him better than his own commanders understand him, you do a different kind of damage. You damage his mind rather than his body, but the scars can be equally deep. Here's a fact that rarely gets discussed. Some German prisoners developed a condition that psychologists now recognize as cultural disorientation after spending years in American camps. They had heard German spoken constantly by American guards, watched Americans understand their jokes and their references. By the time they returned home, some found themselves unable to reintegrate into German society. They didn't fit anymore. The America they had experienced seemed somehow more appealing than the destroyed, devastated Germany they returned to. Some couldn't forget their captors. Years later, a few would write letters back to the camps, trying to reconnect with men who had held them prisoner. The lines between captor and friend had become permanently blurred. This raises an uncomfortable question for historians. Did the use of language as a weapon actually harm the long-term rehabilitation of German prisoners? Did it inadvertently create a generation of men who were psychologically damaged in ways beyond normal trauma? Every letter that arrived in the camps carried weight beyond its physical paper. For German prisoners, thousands of miles from home, mail delivery was the most anticipated moment of each week. Men would gather outside the commandant's office, hoping for handwriting from loved ones. A letter from a wife could sustain a man through months of captivity. a note from a child could remind him why survival mattered. But each letter carried a terrible secret. All correspondence was censored, and not by ordinary soldiers. It was censored by fluent German speakers who could read between lines, who could detect coded messages, who could find escape plans hidden inside family news. One prisoner tried weaving an escape plan into what appeared to be a mundane letter about his childhood dog. He wrote about a particular river they had crossed as children, about a specific bridge where they had rested, about travelling north on certain roads where they had picked berries. To casual readers, it so undid like nostalgic reminiscence. The censor, a guard from the same German region, understood immediately what the letter really meant. The lines were coordinates, the roads were escape routes, the bridges were waypoints. The letter was seized immediately. The escape plan was discovered before it could be executed. The prisoner was moved to higher security. He never forgave himself for underestimating the enemy's understanding of his own language. Another prisoner, devastated by learning that his father had died, wrote desperate responses thick with despair. He wrote about feeling like the war had taken everything from him, about wanting to simply vanish, about his life seeming meaningless without his family. The censor read the letter, understood its meaning, its emotional depth, its psychological vulnerability, and forwarded it to interrogators. Within days, the prisoner was called for questioning. They knew his weaknesses. They knew he was emotionally devastated. They knew his family had been destroyed. They exploited this knowledge mercilessly. Some censors possessed surprising humanity. One former teacher from Munich read a letter from a prisoner's wife begging him to survive and come home. The letter contained one sentence that technically violated censorship regulations, a reference that could be interpreted as encouraging escape. The censor found a way to let one uncensored line slip through, just one sentence. The prisoner wept when he received the letter, understanding that someone had shown mercy, that the enemy possessed humanity. The moment was profound. The use of language to censor, to control, to understand prisoners' most intimate communications remains one of the most troubling aspects of captivity. Should guards have read strictly and reported everything, or did they have the moral right to show mercy? These are questions without easy answers. Men who made these decisions daily likely carried guilt for the rest of their lives. Inside the camps, something unexpected began happening as the war dragged on and victory became certain. Americans, understanding that idle men became problems, began organizing activities. They built libraries stocked with books in German. They organized sports competitions and field days. They allowed theatrical productions written and performed by prisoners. German prisoners, given pencils and paper, began writing plays about their childhoods and their homes. German songs were sung in the evenings. Men formed orchestras with makeshift instruments crafted from salvage and spare parts. German-speaking guards and staff facilitated all of this cultural activity. In some camps, the Americans established something quite remarkable, a cafe. Prisoners could spend meager wages earned through camp work on coffee and luxuries. Menus were written in German. Orders were taken in German. The experience of walking into this space was like stepping into Germany itself, transplanted into captivity. One prisoner wrote in his diary that the surreal experience of standing in a cafe, hearing German all around, served by men in American uniforms, left him unable to categorize what he was experiencing. Was he still a prisoner? Was this kindness or torture? Did compassion exist even in war? The Americans understood something crucial, that creating normalcy was actually a form of control. Men with cultural outlets were less likely to riot or attempt escape. They were psychologically easier to manage. But was it cynical or genuine? The answer was complicated. In one Midwest camp, a guard organized an annual theatrical festival that became legendary among the prisoners. Prisoners performed scenes from Schiller and Goethe. They sang traditional German songs. They recited German poetry. American officers attended these performances. Some officers cried. One American officer, a man who had fought in combat, later confessed that watching these prisoners perform so beautifully reminded him that these were men. They were human beings. They were capable of art and beauty and emotion. The performance shattered his certainty about the enemy. He had seen them as soldiers to be destroyed. Now he saw them as people, saw them. Were the Americans allowing these programs from humanitarian concern or deliberate strategic manipulation? The answer was probably both. They were pragmatic. They understood that men needed hope, cultural outlets, reminders of who they were beyond soldiers. By facilitating these things through German-speaking staff, they achieved multiple goals simultaneously. They maintained order and prevented riots. They demonstrated to prisoners that American culture valued preserving other cultures. They created genuine human connection between captors and captives. They also showed prisoners that Germany had produced something beautiful that America could recognize and respect. Did you know that some of these prisoner performances became so sophisticated that American soldiers from nearby camps would request passes to attend? Drop a yes or no in the comments if that surprises you. Yet not all prisoners welcomed hearing their language from American guards. For some who remained fiercely nationalist, hearing German from men in American uniforms felt like the deepest betrayal imaginable. These men whispered constantly that the guards were Verräter, traitors to Germany, to their blood, to their heritage. Some refused to speak German to guards, insisting on English, or refusing to communicate entirely. In some camps, intensely nationalist prisoners, many of them old-line Wehrmacht officers or SS men, formed secret groups that policed behavior and enforced loyalty among the prisoner population. Any prisoner who became too friendly with German-speaking guards, who laughed at their jokes, who showed gratitude for their kindness, faced ostracism or worse. Rumors spread through the barracks like disease. The guards were spies. The guards were plants designed to corrupt prisoners. Prisoners who cooperated with the guards, who spoke to them willingly, who showed friendship, were traitors themselves and deserved isolation. The psychological pressure was immense and relentless. A prisoner might feel genuinely grateful for a guard's kindness, might feel comforted by familiar German speech, might begin to see the guard as human, but the pressure from fellow prisoners forced public hostility. They were forced to pretend resentment. They were forced to turn away from gestures of kindness. The bitterness ran deep through the camps, like an underground river. Some convinced themselves these German-speaking Americans were worse than ordinary soldiers. The Americans were honest enemies. You knew where you stood with them. But these men, speaking like Germans but serving America, they were internal enemies. They were proof that Germany itself was fractured, that loyalty could be betrayed, that blood didn't actually bind people together as Nazi ideology so passionately. Clay. Mel. This revelation terrified prisoners whose entire worldview was built on Nazi ideology. It challenged the foundation of everything they had been taught. Some died in camps, never forgiving themselves for momentarily feeling comfortable listening to a guard speak German. They carried that shame to their graves. Others eventually came to respect these men, recognizing that choosing to fight against one's own homeland was extraordinary moral courage. They had chosen principle over blood, ideology over ethnicity, conscience over loyalty. Some prisoners years later admitted they understood why these men made their choices. They escaped. They survived the Nazi regime. They built new lives in America. Perhaps they were wiser than those of us who stayed. One former German officer confessed decades after the war in an interview. Perhaps they saw what was coming. But there were moments when resentment gave way to unexpected connection. Moments when German from an American guard pierced through all the barriers and touched something deeper than ideology or nationality. In one Arkansas camp, a guard overheard two prisoners speaking quietly about childhood. One reminisced about his mother, about her cooking, about a specific holiday dish that she used to make every year. The guard, whose own mother had died in Germany before the war, couldn't help himself. He turned toward the prisoners and began describing the same dish in the local dialect of that region. The prisoners froze in absolute silence. The guard continued, describing his own mother, how she had made the same thing, how the aroma would fill their apartment in the winter. One prisoner began weeping openly. For a moment that seemed to exist outside of time. War vanished completely. For a moment, there were just 3 men from the same culture sharing memories of mothers and home and childhood. The guard left them alone after that moment. He didn't speak of it. Neither did the prisoners. Some acts of humanity are too delicate to examine closely, too sacred to convert into narrative. In another camp, a prisoner became seriously ill. High fever, pneumonia developing. The doctors did what they could with limited medicine, but the man seemed fading. A German-speaking guard, whose family had perished in camps, sat with him through the night. He spoke softly in German about his childhood, recited poetry, sang old lullabies. The prisoner survived and recovered. Years later, he told his children he owed his life not to medicine or doctors, but to that voice speaking to him in his own language during the darkest moments. It kept him from surrendering to despair. It kept him connected to his humanity when everything else was stripped away. These moments rarely made official records. They were too personal, too human, too tender to fit into military reports or official documents. But for the men who experienced them, they were everything. They were proof that even in captivity, even in total war, even between enemies, genuine compassion could exist. They were proof that shared language could bridge chasms that seemed unbridgeable. When the war finally ended and camps began emptying in 1945 and 1946, a strange silence fell over the compounds. The barbed wire remained, the watchtowers still stood. The infrastructure of captivity remained intact, but the energy had fundamentally shifted. German prisoners who had spent years in American camps, some nearly 5 years of captivity, began preparing for repatriation. They would return home. They would leave behind this strange world where the enemy spoke their language, where captors showed unexpected kindness, where the lines between guard and human had become blurred. In the final days before departure, something unexpected happened in camps across America. Farewells. Not military protocol. Not formal goodbyes. Genuine human exchanges between guards and prisoners who had spent years together. Some shook hands formally, some embraced. In one documented case, prisoners gave a guard a wooden carving of his hometown church, carved painstakingly from memory, based on stories he had told them during late-night conversations. The carving was remarkably detailed, accurate down to the architectural ornaments. The guard wept openly upon receiving it. For many prisoners, boarding ships brought complex emotions. They had been captives treated with surprising humanity. But they were returning to a devastated Germany, to cities destroyed by bombing, to families decimated by war. The America they were leaving, represented and embodied through the voices and faces of German-speaking guards, seemed almost appealing in comparison. Some found themselves feeling grateful to me, and who had held them prisoner, which created enormous internal conflict. Years later, a few of these prisoners would write letters trying to locate guards they had known. Some corresponded regularly across the decades. Some decades later attempted visits, traveling back to America to reunite with men who had once guarded them. The boundaries between captor and friend had become permanently blurred and confused. The sound of German from American guards had done something no military strategist could have predicted in the planning stages. It had reminded prisoners of common humanity. It had dissolved the category of absolute enemy and replaced it with something more complicated, more human, more difficult to categorize. So what is the legacy of this strange linguistic warfare? It is the legacy of a weapon that was never quite a weapon in the traditional sense. It was the discovery that language could be both comfort and terror simultaneously, both bridge and barrier, both tool of control and tool of liberation. For prisoners, it was the shock of realizing that the enemy was far more sophisticated and far more human than Nazi propaganda had ever suggested. For guards, it was the opportunity to use their exile, their loss, their displacement, their survival as a force for good. They had been forced from Germany. Now they stood guard over Germans. They had been victims of Nazi persecution. Now they held Nazi soldiers prisoner. The irony was profound, but so was the humanity they brought to the role. Many of these guards could have been cruel. They could have used their power for revenge, could have acted out the trauma they had endured. Instead, most chose kindness. They chose to see prisoners as human beings deserving of dignity. They chose to use their language skills to facilitate communication and connection rather than pure interrogation. This choice, repeated thousands of times across dozens of camps, changed the experience of captivity for hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. And perhaps it changed the nature of Allied victory itself. It showed that even in total war, even when nations were separated by ideology and language, even when one side had suffered tremendously, humanity could persist. Connection could occur. One man speaking to another in a shared language could create a moment of peace in the midst of violence. Did you know that some prisoner groups after the war formally thanked the American government for the treatment they had received? The answer to this question might surprise you. Write your thoughts in the comments. Should the world have trusted Stalin? Write your thoughts below because this question shaped the entire post-war world. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more forgotten stories of World War II that challenge everything we think we know about the war.